Welcome to part 6. Dumbledore stared at the three objects upon his desk with loathing. Three tainted relics of the wizarding world that he knew he had to destroy. The famed cup of Helga Hufflepuff, the coveted locket of Salazar Slytherin, and the signet ring of House Peveril. All of them tainted by Lord Voldemort. Dumbledore knew all of these items had to be destroyed. But he was hesitant to do so for several reasons. The first was that he did not yet possess all of the Horcruxes. Thanks to Regulus Black's journal, Dumbledore knew that there was still one hidden within the castle of Hogwarts, though he didn't even have the first inclination of where to look. Nor was he even sure what the object was. He was fairly certain that Lord Voldemort had made his pet snake Nagini into a Horcrux. Though he was unsure as to the reason for such an act. The second reason was more troubling. If he were to destroy these abominations, would Lord Voldemort feel it, and would that in turn drive him into a psychotic rage? There was no denying the Dark Wizard's power, and if he were pushed, he would lay waste to thousands before he could be stopped. And if they didn't have all the pieces, there was always a chance he could return. Dumbledore needed to be sure. And finally, there was the matter of Harry Potter, and the unknown Horcrux. It was last year when Dumbledore fully realized that young Harry had unwittingly been a Horcrux all his life. Since then, he'd been trying to discover a way to free the boy of the burden he carried. He had thought of telling Harry last year after he was informed of the prophecy, but given his state of mind, Dumbledore felt it best to keep that information secret. At least until he'd revealed it to Amelia Bones the previous evening. At first, Dumbledore had not wished to share any more information than he needed to. But when the marriage contract appeared, Dumbledore thought that he finally had his answer to saving Harry Potter. As Amelia was likely going to play a key role in Harry's future, Dumbledore felt it best to inform the woman. Besides, she would be in perfect position to help give her niece a nudge or two in the right direction. The only flaw in the plan was that the two teens could not be coaxed, or manipulated in any way. In order for Dumbledore's hypothesis to work, Harry and Susan had to fall in love in their own time, in their own way. It had to be pure, and it had to be real. No potions or charms could be used. The Horcrux that lived within Harry fed off all the negativity in Harry's life. Dumbledore felt a great wave of guilt for his part in Harry's misery. It had been he who had placed Harry with his aunt and uncle. Had he listened to Professor McGonagall, or sought out Sirius Black and learned the truth then, perhaps Harry would have been better off. But the wards he chose to use to protect Harry required him to reside with blood relations. But because of that choice, the Horcrux remained inside of Harry. But now there was a chance. Dumbledore was confident that if Harry and young Susan Bones could fall in love, the happiness and warmth Harry would feel would then kill off the Horcrux. It would also have the added bonus of actually hurting Lord Voldemort. The Dark Wizard had been truly foolish to use Harry's blood to create a new body for himself. There would be consequences. Dumbledore admitted his curiosity to see just how this would manifest. While they were together in that lovely secluded house, Dumbledore hoped that the two teens would engage in typical teenage behavior. Dumbledore knew that he was an old man, but he still remembered what it was to be young and be ruled by one's physical urges. He also knew that there was a strong possibility of emotions blossoming out of, what did the young people call it? Snogging. Dumbledore chuckled to himself, and his familiar, Fawkes the Phoenix trilled a few musical notes which lightened the headmaster's mood a bit more. Slowly the Hogwarts headmaster placed each Horcrux back into the cabinet, and locked it with spells. He still had some things to attend to before he went to bed. He still had to get in contact with his old friend Horace Slughorn. He had at last filled the vacant defense against the dark arts position, but it now left him with a vacant potions position. Tomorrow, Dumbledore intended to begin his search for the castle Horcrux. He had just over a month before school was to begin, and he hoped to have it before then. Tonks tells me you've been working on concealment. Alastair Mad Eye Moody said as he sat before Harry and Susan. The two teens nodded, and Moody harumphed. It's useful, but you need to concentrate on defense and attack. Moody growled. You do any running? Harry shook his head, and Moody grumbled again. Start. Build up your stamina. Most Death Eaters don't bother with it. They like to end a fight quick before they get tired. Combat takes a lot out of you. All that dodging and casting can wear you down. Build up your stamina and outlast your enemy. Start running. I saw you got a nice bit of water down there. Swimming will help build up your strength and stamina as well. Harry and Susan nodded, and Moody got to his feet and bade the teens to follow him out into the mid-morning sunshine. I ain't got a lot of time, but I wanted to see where you were at so far. Moody said, conjuring a dueling dummy. First off, Potter. Let me see what offensive spells you know. I saw that piercing hex you used on that trash at Bones' house. Start with that. I want to see how accurate you are. Harry cast the spell and hit the dummy's leg. Moody shook his head, and told Harry he needed to aim higher. Harry tried again, and the spell missed entirely. Harry sighed with frustration. He still hadn't managed to be as accurate as he wished he could be, and Moody was in agreement. Needs more work. The old Auror said, and Harry gave him the stink eye. You know the spell, Missy. Susan shook her head, and Moody grumbled again. Learn it. You need to know each other's repertoire of spells so you can fight together. I don't plan on becoming an Auror though. Susan said. And Moody shook his head. I don't think Death Eaters give a flying crap about your future career plans. I'm trying to keep you alive so you can have a career. Despite what you might have been told, war is here. Now, learn each other's every move, and you'll stand a better chance in a fight. Moody spent the next hour examining Harry and Susan's spell work. He mostly criticized, but within the criticisms were also pointers to help the two improve their casting and accuracy. When the hour was up, and Moody had to leave them, he promised the next time he visited, he'd bring them a few books they would find interesting. And he promised to test their shields under a barrage. Harry took it to mean he'd better start practicing his shield charms. He's really scary. Susan said after Moody left through the flue. Yeah. But you can't deny he knows his stuff. Harry said, heading towards the kitchen. I'm not denying it. I just think he's scary. I always think he's looking through my clothes with that eye of his. I think it more likely he's looking through you. Harry said with a smile, and Susan shivered. So what should we do with the rest of our day? Susan asked. All of our homework is done, and I don't feel like training all day. Harry sat down at the small table in the kitchen as Winky set 2 bowls of soup and a platter of sandwiches there. I don't know. Harry shrugged. My new broom hasn't arrived yet, so flying is out. I could use a levitation spell on you. Susan offered and laughed as Harry glared at her. It was only a suggestion. It wasn't a very good one. Harry said. I do have an idea. We could share stories. We haven't talked a whole lot since we've been here. It's been mostly work. Susan suggested. Harry thought about her idea. The truth was that even though they had been together every day since they'd moved into the cottage, they had barely talked. At least not anything serious. They'd mostly been working on their homework, or working with Tonks, or something similar. Harry knew they needed some time to connect, and Harry had promised himself he would try to figure things out with Susan. He felt a little bad that he hadn't made any attempts up until now. All right. Harry said. How do we start? Okay. First we have to promise that everything we say to each other will be the truth. Also, We can't leave anything out, no matter how scary, embarrassing or hot. Hot. Harry quirked an eyebrow. I've got a few stories that might keep you up all night. And I don't mean awake. Susan said, and both she and Harry blushed, though they laughed. Okay. Harry said, clearing his throat. Okay, I promise I'll be completely honest. Good. Now, you tell me a story, and then I'll share one with you. Why do I have to go first? Harry asked, looking put out. Because I'm the girl, and I want you to. Susan stated. Harry shook his head, claiming it was unfair. Susan pointed out that life was unfair, and Harry agreed with her. All right. Okay, I got one. Before second year, I was at my aunt and uncle's house. And they were getting ready for this sort of dinner party thing. Susan finished her lunch as she listened to the story of how Harry had first met Dobby. And the floating pudding that fell on a woman's head. Susan laughed at Harry's confusion and frustration on this first encounter with the house elf who now served him loyally. She was also horrified to learn of the consequences of that initial meeting, and the lengths the Dursleys had tried to go to prevent Harry from returning to Hogwarts. So if you were locked up, how did you get out and get back to school? Susan asked. Ron and his brother took their dad's flying car to come get me. Harry said. That's right. Susan snapped her fingers. Second year was the year you and Ron showed up at school in that flying car. Everybody was talking about it. Not our finest hour. But we were young, and we were so freaked out about missing the train, I guess it didn't occur to us that someone could have flued us there or something. Harry shrugged. So, it's your turn now. Okay. Susan smiled. She then told Harry a story about her first bit of accidental magic in which a rather important dignitary from some other country was visiting her and ended up naked. Harry was on the floor clutching his stomach, tears pouring from his eyes as he laughed. On and on it went with the two teens sharing humorous stories, though Susan's stories were far funnier than Harry's. Eventually though, Susan realized her plan wasn't working. At least not as good as she had thought. Harry was deliberately avoiding talking about certain things. She knew that she shouldn't push him, but she felt that it was going to be the only way she was going to get through Harry's defenses. Why haven't you told me anything scary or sad? She asked. Harry looked at her with a puzzled expression. We've all heard the rumors about things you've gotten up to at school. Why haven't you told me some of those stories? Why would you want to hear anything like that? He asked. Because it's part of who you are. Susan replied. You haven't told me anything like that. Harry pointed out. That's true, but since we're being honest, the scariest thing that's ever really happened to me was when Death Eaters attacked my house. And you were there for that? She said. Harry nodded, and sighed. They had moved their storytelling to the large wooden deck so they could enjoy the afternoon sunshine. Harry slumped in his chair a bit as he thought about what Susan was asking him. I can understand your curiosity, but to be honest, I'm not really fond of reliving those things. He said finally. Susan smiled her understanding and patted his shoulder. I don't mean to push or pry. She started and Harry shook his head. It isn't that. In fact, you're way more patient than Hermione. She'd harp on me until I spilled my guts, and we'd end up angry at each other. That must be why she constantly tells me to take things slow with you. Susan smirked. And Harry rolled his eyes. I think it's really in how she approaches it. If she'd just let me tell her in my own time, we might not have any problems. She freaked out when I told her I planned to flirt with you in the pool that day. Harry turned sharply. And Susan's face burned with embarrassment. You planned that? Harry asked. Well. No, I mean yes. Susan said quickly, and then waved her hands in front of her as if she were erasing an imaginary blackboard. Not exactly. I felt that maybe if I gave you a taste of what you could be getting, you might open up a bit and let me into your world. Also, I kind of wanted to, you know, get a look. Harry could only stare in shock at Susan, who was now avoiding his eyes. Wow, was all he could say. I just didn't know what else to do to break through your walls, and I figured you were a boy, and if I couldn't get your attention that way, then it was possible you were. No, I noticed. Harry said emphatically. The funny thing was, during the movie I promised myself I would make a better effort to get to know you. I just wasn't sure how to go about it. Talking to me is a good start, Susan said, and Harry nodded. I'm sorry I haven't done more of that, he said, and Susan shook her head. It's okay. I'm not asking for you to bare your soul to me, and I get that you're a private person, Susan said, looking at him again. What did you mean by give me a taste of what I could be getting? Harry asked, and Susan's face burned scarlet once again. Harry. Susan scowled when he began to laugh. She socked him in the arm and he yelped, but continued laughing. I'm sorry, Harry said when Susan got up from her seat and stepped away. She turned and glared at him. That wasn't funny. If you'd been me, you would have found it a little funny, Harry quipped, and Susan rolled her eyes, throwing her hands up in exasperation. Harry's laughter finally settled down and they stared at each other for a bit. Would it be so bad? Susan asked after a long silence. You and me, I mean. I don't know how to answer that, Harry said. Susan came back to sit next to him. Do you find me attractive? Susan asked in a rush. Do you like how I look? Yeah. Harry choked and Susan smiled. I find you attractive as well. So, here's what I'm thinking. Maybe we're taking things too slow. Maybe the reason we keep hitting these walls and stuff is because we're both so overwhelmed by the whole contract thing. Maybe we need to jump ahead. I don't know if I follow you, Harry said. We start dating. Susan smiled. But we barely know each other, Harry pointed out. I know. But people get together and start dating all the time, and they get to know each other while they're dating, Susan replied. I'm not saying we go crazy and jump into bed together or anything like that, but maybe if we just bypass this get to know each other phase and fold it into what would logically be the next step for us, it might help us to open up and trust each other. If we're not snogging or any of that. How is it different from how things are now? Harry asked. Because, if the urge conies over us to share a kiss, or hold hands or any of the stuff couples do. We can. Couldn't we do that anyway? Stop trying to tear holes in my logic, please. Just tell me what you think, Susan said, giving Harry another, although softer punch in the arm. Are you going to always be punching me? Only when you're a prat, Susan promised. And Harry chuckled. Okay, honestly, I don't really see any flaws in your logic. And, as you said, it would be the next step, I guess. And maybe you're right, and we do need to bypass this initial stuff. And don't forget that we're attracted to each other physically. I don't see what that has to do with it, Harry said, perplexed. Would you be willing to date me if I looked like Eloise Midgen, or Millicent Bulstrode? Susan asked, and Harry shivered. Exactly. Okay. So, we're dating then? Harry asked, and Susan smiled. Yes. She looked pleased. No, we're not, Harry said. Susan looked at him with confusion. Susan, would you be my girlfriend? Harry asked. Susan remembered once that Hermione had told her that if given the chance, Harry might actually try to sweep her off the feet. Susan couldn't help but grin as she said yes to Harry, and laughed when he nodded and said, "Now we're dating." The idea of moving past all the pain and frustration of getting to know one another and moving right into the dating part of their relationship seemed to be a really good idea in theory to Harry. In practice, it was proving far more awkward and intimidating than things had been. Over the next week, Harry and Susan, when they weren't practicing spell work with Tonks or each other, were trying to figure out exactly how to move their relationship forward. There were more than a few times when each or both of the young teens felt embarrassed, awkward, or just plain stupid. They were no better off than they were a week previous when Susan suggested the idea. Harry sat on his bed looking out his window as he thought back on the week, and realized that they had actually had one nice moment, only the previous evening. Harry had been sitting on the couch in the sitting room reading a book when Susan had decided to join him. She had sat next to him at first, reading along with him. Slowly, as they continued to read on, Susan had curled up next to him, and Harry had found himself with his arm around his new girlfriend. There was now weirdness in it, and Harry had liked having Susan's head on his shoulder. He only wished he could have stopped looking at her legs so much and focused more on his reading, but overall, it had been really nice. Harry hoped that they could have more moments like that in the near future. There had been no pressure and it was extremely comfortable. Harry sighed as he got up. Today was his 16th birthday, and that evening, Susan and Amelia were throwing him a birthday party. Harry was excited because Ron and the rest of the Weasleys were coming, along with Hermione and Zach as well as Neville and Hannah. Tonks had also promised she would be coming and bringing along Lupin, who Harry hadn't seen or spoken to since that night at the Ministry, something for which Harry felt guilty over. He intended to apologize to Lupin for his selfishness. Harry went downstairs for breakfast and found Susan and Amelia preparing to use the flute. "Good morning, Harry." Amelia smiled. "Happy birthday." "Thank you." Harry smiled. Susan gave him a warm hug, and a soft peck on the cheek. "We've got to get a few things for your party." The redhead smiled. "So you'll be on your own for most of the morning?" "I think I can manage." Harry smirked. "Hermione asked to come early, so she'll likely be here by lunchtime." Amelia said. "Everyone else will likely be showing up around 5. Susan and I will be back by 2. Do not leave the property unless—" "I know," Harry said, smiling at Amelia. "I've got my emergency porte-clés with me, I'll be fine," Harry said. Amelia nodded and she and Susan flew away, leaving Harry alone for the first time since they'd began living at the cottage. Dobby brought Harry breakfast and Harry thanked the little elf for his service. Dobby smiled brightly, and disappeared to carry on his work. After he ate, Harry went outside to practice, but found that without Susan, he wasn't really in the mood. He pushed himself, however, as he didn't want to become complacent. Besides, he needed to be ready for Moody's next visit. After Harry finished his workout routine, concluding with several laps around the property, which was fairly large, Harry showered and dressed, and found it was only a few minutes before noon when Hermione was due to arrive. When Dumbledore and Bill Weasley set up the wards, one of the things they did was to set up a point for visitors to apparate and porte-clés to away from the house. It was at the bottom of the hill on which the cottage was built along a dirt path that led to the house. Harry walked down the path and reached the porte-clés point just as Hermione fell on her rear end. "I will never get the hang of that," she squealed as she got to her feet, rubbing her tailbone. "If you're going to land like that, you might think about using a inflation charm on each cheek." Harry smirked. "I'll inflate your head," Hermione said menacingly, though she was smiling brightly. She hugged her best friend tightly, and they walked back up to the house together, Harry filling her in on everything that had happened since the attack a few weeks ago. The story continued through their lunch. "So, you're dating Susan now?" Hermione asked, looking impressed. "We're trying it out," Harry said. "She made a good case. It's been awkward, but last night we sat together and read, and for the first time, it was really nice." "Have you kissed her yet?" Hermione was curious. "No." Harry shook his head. "To be honest, I've been really freaked out most of the week because I wasn't sure what's allowed. I mean, she said that we could hold hands and all the things couples do. But every time I think about doing it, I freak out and I end up practically running away." "Well, I wouldn't worry too much, Harry. You're in rather a unique situation," Hermione said reassuringly. "Tell me about it." Harry sighed. Hermione smiled softly, and then decided to change the topic. "Have you talked to Ron lately?" Hermione asked. "I got a letter from him yesterday, saying that he'll be here for my birthday." "He's written fairly regularly." "For Ron anyway." Harry laughed, but Hermione looked a bit dejected. "What's up?" "He hasn't written me at all," Hermione said. "Not since we saw each other last and he found out about me and Zach. I think he might be really mad at me." "I don't think he's mad at you," Harry said with a knowing look. "I think he's more hurt than angry." "Why would he be hurt?" Hermione looked confused. "You know, for being the smartest witch of our age." "You're a bit clueless." Harry grinned. "Ron's got a thing for you." "Did he tell you that?" Hermione asked, looking gobsmacked. "Didn't have to. I've kind of figured since the Yule Ball that he had some feelings for you, and they were all but confirmed when he found out you had a boyfriend. I think he might be upset that he didn't get the chance to ask you out himself." "I never even thought about that," Hermione admitted. "I mean, I guess I've known that he might be. I don't know, maybe crushing on me, but I never thought he had real feeling for me in that way. But, I don't think he and I would have worked out. We just argue so much, and he constantly hurts my feelings. Yeah, he's defended me against Malfoy and stuff like that, but then he turns around and insults me and stuff. Sometimes I've wondered why we're even friends in the first place. I would guess because of me," Harry said. "Partially." Hermione nodded. "But Ron and I have connected at times, and one think he can be a really good person. But I just can't see any situation where he and I would be happy dating." "You don't have to explain this to me." Harry smiled. "I've thought the same thing about the two of you. I never talked to him about it because he never brought it up. One figured the two of you would figure things out in your own time. You seem to have, and now he's going to have to. Besides, there are loads of girls at school. He could end up with someone who's perfect for him." "Exactly," Hermione said. "But I still feel a bit guilty." "Why should you?" Harry asked. "You like Zach, and so long as you're happy, that should be the only thing that matters. I probably should have told you both, though," Hermione said. But Harry shook his head. "It's your business," he said with a smile. "If you want us to know about stuff, you'll tell us, and we, as your friends, should respect your privacy." Hermione thanked her best friend, and then asked for a tour of his new home. They walked through the house, and Harry took her out to the stream which he and Susan had yet to utilize. Harry admitted to Hermione that he had wanted to go swimming, but not because it was good exercise. Hermione rolled her eyes, and gave him a little shove, huffing, "Boys." Harry and Hermione arrived back at the house a few minutes after Amelia and Susan returned from their shopping. Each loaded down with bags. "Hi, Hermione." Susan smiled at seeing the bushy-haired witch. "Can I give you a hand?" Hermione asked, and Susan held up an arm, allowing Hermione to take a few bags. Harry began to help when both Susan and Amelia shouted at him to stay back. "What?" Harry asked in surprise. "You just stay out of here, and let us handle everything," Susan said. Hermione snickered at the look of confused fear on her friend's face. The three women disappeared into the kitchen, leaving a stunned Harry alone once again. Susan came out of the kitchen a moment later and apologized for shouting at him. She gave him a brief hug and suggested that he go for a fly on his new broom. Harry smiled, and gave his girlfriend a quick hug before dashing up the stairs to fetch his new firebolt, which had finally arrived the day before. Once outside, Harry leapt into the air and soared high into the sky. It had been far too long since he'd been in the air, and the feel of the sun on his face and the roar of the wind in his ears was too intense for words. He knew he only had a few hours until guests started to arrive, and Harry decided to make the best of them. In the kitchen, Amelia and the two teenage girls began unpacking the shopping bags full of food, as the two house elves began preparing that night's meal and putting things away. "It's good to see you, Hermione." Susan smiled when she re-entered the kitchen after sending Harry to fly. "How have you been?" "Good. Harry tells me you and he are an item. And a cute one at that," Amelia said over her shoulder. "You should have seen them all snuggled on the couch last night." Amelia had spied the two teens before she'd gone to bed. And it had made her feel so happy to see that they were trying to move their relationship forward. She couldn't help but feel a spark of hope that these two young people who'd been forced together could actually find real happiness. She knew it was still early, but they'd had an intense few weeks. Seeing Susan all curled up in Harry's arms on the couch had made Amelia very emotional, and she was grateful neither teen had seen her. "Okay, enough." Susan rolled her eyes. "She's been poking fun at me all day." Amelia smacked Susan on her rear with a package of sausages, giving her niece a faux dirty look. "I will not have you besmirching me to your friends." Amelia snapped, "It was only half the day." Hermione roared with laughter, and Susan giggled as well. "How's Hannah?" Hermione asked when she settled down. "Good," Susan said. "I'm glad she's coming today, I've really missed her." "How's Zach?" "Good. He came to my house for dinner last weekend, and he and my dad got along really well. Mum and Dad even talked about taking him to France with us if his parents agreed." "You're going to France?" Amelia asked. "We'll be gone the last 2 weeks of the summer holiday. And I'll get back the day before we're supposed to go back to school." Hermione smiled. "I'm really looking forward to it." The three ladies talked more about Hermione's upcoming trip, and Amelia recommended a few places that might interest Hermione. Together they worked to get the whole house ready for the party, and at 5, Amelia went down the hill to meet all the guests. Harry showed up again about 15 minutes after 5. Just as all the guests were entering the house. "Oh, Harry!" Mrs. Weasley shouted as she engulfed him in a bone-cracking hug. "Oh, it's so good to see you. You're looking very well despite everything." "Can't breathe," Harry muttered, and Mrs. Weasley pulled away, her cheeks pink with embarrassment. "It's good to see you, Mrs. Weasley," Harry said when he got a few breaths. "How have you been?" "Going spare with worry." Fred smiled. "We wonder if she sometimes forgets that we're here, too." George smirked, and Mrs. Weasley smacked both twins on the arm. "Hello, Harry." Mr. Weasley smiled, shaking Harry's hand. "Wonderful place you have." "Thank you," Harry replied. "We've of course heard all about what's been happening to you," Mrs. Weasley said, still not having let go of Harry. "How are you holding up?" Is there anything we can do for you? You know we're always here for you, Harry dear. Enough Molly. Mr. Weasley smiled, taking his wife and beginning to lead her away. Let's not monopolize all of Harry's time. Harry greeted Ron, Ginny, Tonks, Lupin, who Harry immediately apologized to for not writing. Lupin also apologized for being distant, and the two agreed to try and be better. Harry then greeted Moody, Zach, Hannah, Neville, Angelina Johnson and Alicia Spinnet, who'd accompanied the twins and Bill Weasley along with Bill's new fiancée. Fleur? Harry asked, not believing his eyes. We, Harry. It is so good to be seeing you again. Fleur said, kissing Harry on each cheek. You're going to be marrying Bill? How'd you guys even meet? Harry asked. At the end of the Triwizard Tournament. Bill said. Fleur started working at Gringotts and we started dating not long after that. Well. Congratulations. Harry said. Thank you. Fleur said as she and Bill began to mingle. Harry really enjoyed his party. And spoke with everyone at length before opening presents and enjoying the cake that Dobby and Winky had created. As the party wore on, the adults congregated in the sitting room discussing politics and things of that nature, while the teens headed outside to enjoy the summer night. The boys found themselves on the deck, butterbeers in hand, talking Quidditch and girls while the girls had congregated on the grass not too far away to talk about boys. Pretty great place you got here, Harry. Zach said looking around. Be a great place for a few pick-up Quidditch games. Fred pointed out. All you need is some hoops. George nodded. Did you replace your broom? Neville asked. Hannah said you probably lost it in the fire. Yeah, I kind of had to if I wanted to play this year. Got it yesterday. Harry nodded. I flew for a bit before everyone showed up. Firebolt? Ron asked. Come on. Fred said. Of course it is. What else would Harry get? I almost went back to Nimbus. Harry said with a shrug. The 2010s are pretty nice looking, but I did a bit of reading, and the Firebolts are still the best out there. It's kind of your signature. George said. You should have written the company owner. I bet he would have given you one for free just so you'd endorse it. I'm thinking of trying out for the team this year. Zach said. Though I don't know if they'll be replacing anyone this year. Never hurts to try. Ron said. Worst that can happen is you don't make it, but you'll never know if you don't try. I mean, I stink, and they let me on the team. You don't stink. Harry said. You just need to be more confident and you'll play loads better. We've all seen that you can be one of the best keepers around, so long as you don't get too nervous. I'll second that. Fred nodded. Weasley is our king. George sang. And all the boys laughed. Harry. Harry turned and found Ginny standing there, hands clasped in front of her. Hey, Ginny, what's up? Could I talk to you for a minute? Privately. Harry missed the quick looks Ginny shared with Ron as he got up from his chair, and followed Ginny into the house and up the stairs. They went into Harry's room where Ginny shut the door before turning to him, looking nervous. Harry noticed that Ginny was becoming a very attractive young woman. I wanted to apologize first of all that I didn't get you a birthday present, but I really didn't know what to get you. Also, I've been kind of preoccupied about a few things. She said nervously. That's okay. Harry said. Not really understanding what Ginny was getting at. I feel like you've been cheated out of something very special, Harry. All your life, you've been forced to do stuff that you should never have even had to worry about, and now you've had all the fun of finding someone special taken away. And you'll never get to have a moment like this. Like what? Harry had begun to say, but he never got it out because Ginny had wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her lips to his. His body reacted instinctively, and his hands went to her hips, though he didn't draw her closer, nor did he push her away. His mind had been too startled to even comprehend what was happening. It was only when Ginny tried to deepen the kiss that his brain re-engaged, and he pulled away. But before he could say anything, or do anything, he heard a choked sob, and looked up to find Susan standing in the doorway, staring wide-eyed at the two of them. Harry stared out at the woods surrounding his home in contemplation. He'd spent most of the past 2 weeks since his birthday this way. Ever since Ginny Weasley had kissed him and completely messed up his life. Harry had been stuck between intense frustration and anger at Ginny for doing what she had, and overwhelming guilt for his part in hurting Susan. Susan had looked so wounded when Harry had discovered her in his doorway. Before he'd had the chance to say anything, Susan had lunged at Ginny and punched her right in the face. Ginny fell back like a rag doll, and Harry was sure Susan was going to attack Ginny again, and started to get between them. Susan simply turned and ran right out of the house. Harry was told later that she had gone to Hannah's house. Susan returned 2 days later, but she'd been very cold towards him ever since. Harry had tried on more than one occasion to apologize to Susan, but the redhead usually walked away, or just glared at him in stony silence. Harry had finally given up trying to apologize. Susan just didn't seem to want to hear it. With every passing day, Harry's vision of their married life became more and more like his worst nightmares. Susan's aunt hadn't said anything to either of them over the matter. Harry guessed that she was staying out of the middle of it altogether, opting to let the two youngsters figure things out on their own. However, Harry noted a constant look of disappointment on Amelia's face each night when she arrived home. A few days earlier, their owl results had arrived. Harry had been in his room reading when he heard Susan shouting joyfully. He went to investigate, and as soon as she saw him, her smile vanished and she disappeared into her room until Amelia came home that night. To make matters worse, it was affecting his training. His concentration was all but gone, and he couldn't seem to do anything right. Susan still trained with him whenever Tonks came by, and was present when Moody showed up to test the two teens again. Both Harry and Susan had endured through Moody's onslaught of spells, and then his disappointment that they had clearly not been working together since he'd last seen them. Such was Moody's ire, that he suggested the two just go out and select their caskets right away, as they were quite clearly going to be killed. As Harry stared into the woods, he couldn't say that he even cared if Voldemort himself showed up and struck him down. He simply had no idea how he could make things right between himself and Susan, or at the very least make it to where they could be in the same room together. He was sure their short relationship was over, and they were no longer a couple. Harry was truly upset over that. While it hadn't been easy, Harry liked having Susan as a girlfriend. She was fun, and becoming easier to talk to. While he hadn't opened up to her as she wanted, he was warming to her, and he felt that until his birthday party, the same could be said for the redhead. His feeling had taken him a bit by surprise, and he'd only begun to realize that he was really starting to like Susan, after the incident with Ginny. Though, he had had a lot of time to think about things, as he was constantly on his own. Harry found Susan very attractive. She was only a bit shorter than he was, with very pretty blue eyes, and long red hair, that was darker than the Weasleys', but still vibrant. Despite laying in the sun all the time, her skin was the color of soft cream. She had an athletic figure. She wasn't fat by any stretch, but she wasn't super skinny. She was well proportioned with a classic hourglass figure. Harry was particularly fond of Susan's legs, and her rear, but could not deny that he was intrigued by her chest as well. He liked the way she smelled, and how she felt when she was curled up with him on the couch. But more than that, Susan was very intelligent. And when they talked, she kept his attention. That was good, because Harry felt that a relationship based solely on a person's looks was doomed to failure. Cho had proven that. Susan was also fun. Her smile and her laugh were contagious, and Harry had never laughed as much as he did when he was with Susan. All in all, Susan was pretty much everything Harry liked in a girl. The only thing he could say about her was that she didn't play Quidditch, but after Cho, Harry wasn't sure that he wanted to date someone who was a fanatic. Harry sighed with exasperation as his gaze journeyed to the stream they had yet to swim in. He remembered when they had first come to this house and how she had taken him by the hand and they had waded a little way into the water to see just how cold it was. Rising to his feet, Harry decided to go down to the stream. Collecting a handful of rocks, Harry began skipping them on the water as he began to think about the coming school year. He'd been looking forward to starting the new year with Susan as his girlfriend. He knew that there was going to be a lot of talk, but he was used to it now. Harry and Susan had talked about what they were going to tell people, and they had agreed to never mention the contract. But all of that was gone now, thanks to Ginny. Harry had written to Ron to ask if he knew why his sister had kissed him. Ron had replied saying that Ginny had felt robbed of potentially dating Harry because of the contract. It was Ron's guess that Ginny just wanted to know what she was going to miss to something like that. Harry grimaced when he thought about that. How could Ginny even think for a second that they would have dated? Ginny could barely talk to him for longer than 5 minutes. She'd been a blushing klutz for most of the time they'd known each other. Yes, she had calmed down a lot in the last year, but they still had barely spoken to each other, and in all honesty, Ginny just never struck his fancy, and he couldn't imagine that changing. Then again, Harry admitted that life happens, and it was possible that maybe one day they might have dated. Harry just couldn't see it happening. Especially after what had happened 2 weeks ago. Harry turned when he heard the door open and shut. He saw Susan on the deck of the house, looking down at him, though he was too far away to see her expression. He imagined her scowling at him, and he turned back to the water. He'd thrown his last rock, so he sat down on the bank and just let the sound of the water ease his mind. After a few moments he heard soft footsteps, and turned to see Susan approaching him. She was wearing her favorite pair of cut-off shorts and a simple black tank top. Harry's teenage hormones stirred when he saw the strap of her soft pink bra. Fortunately, his mood was too dark to be concerned about that. Mostly. There was an long, uncomfortable silence when Susan sat down next to Harry. "I know it wasn't your fault," Susan finally said. "I know that she forced herself on you, and I know why she did it. I don't like it, but I understand it." "How do you know why she did it?" Harry asked, his voice low as he watched the stream. "Hermione," Susan said simply. "She's been writing to me and Ginny, trying to play mediator or something. I keep telling her that after that, I just don't think Ginny and I will ever be friends." Harry just nodded and the silence fell over them again. "I never meant to hurt you," Harry said after a long time. Susan nodded, pulling her legs to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. "I know," Susan replied. They sat quietly for a few moments before Susan took a deep breath and ripped up a handful of grass. "I've had 2 boyfriends. Ernie and I dated at the end of 3rd year, but it didn't last very long, and all we ever did was hold hands. Then I went out with Wayne in 4th year, but he and I never connected really. We both decided to go our separate ways after our first kiss. It was weird, and wrong somehow. Like kissing a relative or something. It was not long after that that I started to really like Zach. "Why are you telling me this?" Harry started to say, but Susan held up a hand. "You'll understand in a minute. Let me just get through this." Harry nodded and Susan continued. "I tried everything I could to get Zach to notice me as more than a friend. We had one kiss during a game of Truth or Dare, and I poured everything I could into that kiss so he would know that I liked him, and that I could be something much more than a friend. But, he wanted Hermione. What I'm getting at is that I don't have a lot of dating experience, and even without the contract that forced us together, I am really starting to like you. When we started dating, it just felt good. It was like there was no contract, and you and I were just normal. And then it all gets flushed down the toilet. I've been having a real hard time trying to figure out just what I'm supposed to do here." "You haven't been the only one," Harry said. "I'm sorry for being so mean to you, but I just couldn't figure out how I was supposed to act. I haven't been angry at you, I've been angry at myself, and I didn't want to take it out on you. I was also really jealous of Ginny. Because she did what I had planned on doing that very night. I wanted to be the one to kiss you." Harry's head shot up and he turned to look at Susan, who was still hugging her knees, her head resting on her knees. "You wanted to kiss me?" "I had talked to Hermione and she helped me figure out the perfect way to do it. When we said goodnight, I was going to kiss you. I'd been wanting to kiss you for a while, even before we became a couple, if I'm going to be honest. I just didn't know how to go about it. Anyway, when I saw that Ginny was kissing you, when it should have been me, I just got so angry." "I'm really sorry," Harry said again. "I told you that I don't blame you," Susan replied. "Hermione wasn't kidding about your saving people complex. She said you were probably being eaten alive by your guilt." Harry rolled his eyes at the mention of his personality quirk. He ran his hands through his messy black hair and sighed. "I've been so confused about why Ginny felt she had to kiss me. When I first met her she couldn't even talk to me. She would always squeak, blush and run away, not necessarily in that order. I hated it. To me she had become the embodiment of everything I hated about being famous. People falling over themselves to meet me or whatever. It made me even more self-conscious and annoyed. When we got to school it got worse, thanks mostly to that egomaniac Lockhart," Harry said bitterly. Susan was listening closely to him, realizing that Harry was once again allowing her a peek into his soul. This hadn't happened since that night after her house was burned down and they had all nearly died. She turned herself a bit so she was looking at him fully as he continued. "What I didn't know at the time was that she was pouring her soul into a diary that had been slipped to her by Lucius Malfoy. It was cursed. It had once belonged to Voldemort." Susan's eyes nearly came out of her head when Harry said this, but she said nothing, knowing Harry was going to explain it all to her. She just had to be patient. With every word she wrote in that thing, she was unwittingly giving Voldemort power. I don't know exactly how it worked, only that it was feeding off her, gaining power. It was able to possess her and make her do some really bad things, including opening the Chamber of Secrets. It was her. Harry nodded. "You can't mention this to anyone. None of it was her fault, but she doesn't need the kind of attention that would give her. No one does. Voldemort possessed her, and made her do it." Susan nodded that she would not tell anyone what she was being told, and Harry continued. "Anyway, near the end of the year, Ginny had given enough of herself to allow for Voldemort to become corporeal. He made her go down into the Chamber of Secrets where he could complete his goal and return himself to life. When Ron and I learned about what had happened, we went after her, but it was me that actually found the chamber and fought Voldemort and a basilisk. I saved her that night, nearly dying myself. Harry took a breath, and Susan simply waited for him to continue. Ron once said that he wouldn't be surprised if Ginny owed me a life debt. He never explained what that was, and I never cared enough to ask about it. Saving her was the right thing to do, and that was all that mattered. I didn't do it for more fame, or anything like that. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Hermione was the one who told me that Ginny had a crush on me. The thing is, and this is true still, I've never felt anything for Ginny more than friends. Part of it is because she's Ron's sister, and part is because of how she always acted. When she kissed me, I was just so stunned that I couldn't even think. I had no clue as to what was happening or why. It wasn't until she tried to make the kiss more that my brain clicked back on, and I pushed her away. You did push her away? Susan said. I've thought about that night so many times, but I was never sure what I saw. I pushed her away, because I was with you. I wanted to be with you, and if you hadn't been there, I would have told Ginny that she shouldn't have done that, and that I was dating you. She needs to get over her feelings for me because her and I will never be. You wanted to be with me? Susan asked, looking into Harry's eyes. Yeah. Do you still want to be with me? In spite of the contract? Harry nodded, not sure where Susan was going with this. I still want to be with you too, she said, a hint of a smile tugging on the corner of her mouth. She reached out and took Harry's hand in hers and stared into his eyes as she felt this warmth spread from her chest through her entire body. She ran her thumb softly over the raised lines of the scars he'd been forced to cut into his own flesh and sighed. Harry was confused by everything that was happening. He looked into her soft blue eyes, hoping to see some sign that would explain it all to him, but all he saw was something that left him with more questions. He opened his mouth to voice his confusion, but his throat cut off the queries before they could be voiced. Then he felt Susan tug his arm softly, and he began to lean towards her. He felt her other hand softly cup his cheek, and he saw that she was leaning towards him, her eyes fluttering closed as she brushed her soft lips against his in their first kiss. It was indescribably soft, like a whisper in the wind. Their lips just barely grazed against each other at first, and Susan pulled back just a bit. She inhaled softly before capturing Harry's lips ever so delicately again, holding the kiss just a bit longer this time. Slowly she felt Harry's hand slid up her arm and slip to the back of her neck. He didn't pull her closer, now did he push her away. He simply held her there, which sent shivers through her body. Susan pulled away once more, this time opening her eyes to look at Harry, who for the first time that she could remember looked truly at peace and calm. His eyes were brighter than she'd ever seen them, and he had the softest of smiles on his face. Seeing his expression of hope and contentment made her heart flutter, and she released his hands so she could wrap both her hands around his neck and kiss him more properly. This wasn't anything like the kiss she had shared with Zack so long ago. This was something else entirely, and Susan knew exactly why. Unlike when she kissed Zack, Harry was actually returning her feelings, however unsure of them he was. This was not one-sided, nor was it the result of a dare. Harry was kissing her because he wanted to. Knowing that simple fact ignited something within her, and Susan knew that she wanted to see where this would lead. Over and over, Hermione's words kept repeating in her mind. Harry will spend his life trying to make you happy. Harry didn't know why Susan was kissing him, but he didn't really feel that he needed to understand at the moment. He liked Susan a lot and he liked kissing her. Susan wasn't crying, nor had she surprised him. Well, that wasn't entirely true, but she hadn't attacked him. She had drawn him to her and tested the waters, so to speak. Harry held her still, not sure what he should be doing, though all he wanted was to pull Susan into his lap and hold her tightly to him and keep on kissing her. He was really beginning to like her as something different from just a friend, and he was sure that with this kiss, they were once again a couple. If they had ever stopped being one in the first place. And then Harry began to feel something very strange. A tingling in his scar. Not like the kind he usually got whenever Voldemort was angry or happy. This felt different. Almost like when his foot fell asleep. It didn't last long, so Harry didn't think about it too much. He much preferred thinking about kissing Susan anyway. Unbeknownst to either teen, they were being watched by a very relieved, and slightly concerned Amelia who'd just arrived home, and had gone looking for the wayward teens. She had been about to call out to them when she saw them share their first kiss. A wave of hope washed over Amelia as she watched them take their first step towards happiness. The last 2 weeks had been nearly unbearable with all the tension between the two, and Amelia was nearly at her breaking point. She didn't want to interfere, but she wasn't sure how much more she could stand. Fortunately for everyone, Susan and Harry had finally figured out their issue, and had gotten themselves back on track. Amelia decided to allow them a few more minutes of bliss before she broke them apart for dinner. She knew they would have plenty of opportunity to explore this new facet of their evolving relationship. Her only hope was that they didn't push themselves too far too fast. They were still young, and had a couple of years before they had to be married. There would be plenty of time for them to go crazy. Hopefully. Harry sat in his bedroom, reading over a book he'd received that day. He had to replace several of his books after the fire at Susan's home, and he'd been happy when the new books had arrived earlier in the day. Harry had also received one other piece of mail. Professor Dumbledore had written, asking if he would be agreeable to take part in a rather important errand that evening around 11. Harry had responded that he would be happy to help, and now all he had was the waiting. Harry's mind had wandered all day, and he was still having trouble focusing on his reading. His mind kept replaying the kiss he had shared with his girlfriend by the stream the previous day. It was unlike anything Harry had experienced in his life. Harry only wished that it hadn't come as the result of so much trouble. Harry still had no idea what it was that Ginny had wanted to accomplish by kissing him. He was pretty sure he didn't want to know either. His life was already complicated enough. Harry still could not stop smiling like a fool whenever he thought about kissing Susan. They had kissed several more times since that first one by the stream, but nothing came close. So far they had only shared a few quick pecks. Harry thought maybe Susan was worried about her aunt catching them or something. He hated that they hadn't been alone since the previous evening. Susan had gone to Hannah's not long after breakfast that morning, and Amelia left for work afterwards. But they would be back in school soon, and if Susan, Hannah, Seamus, Dean, and many others were to be believed, there were hundreds of places a couple could go for a bit of private time. If he really wanted to, he could take Susan to the room of requirement and have several hours alone without the fear of being caught. Harry grinned to himself as he let his mind picture himself alone with Susan in her bikini. As he imagined touching her bare skin and what it might feel like, he began to feel the strange tingling in his scar again. It had started the previous night when he and Susan had shared their first kiss, and he'd felt it tingle a couple of times that day. It wasn't like before whenever Voldemort was happy or angry. This was something else entirely. It didn't hurt at all. It just tingled, like when his foot fell asleep. It was really very strange. Almost as strange as the fact that he'd not felt or seen anything from the Dark Lord's mind all summer. Harry decided that he should probably ask Dumbledore about it, as he seemed to be the only one who had any sort of clue about his scar. Checking the new watch he'd gotten in London before he'd moved into the cottage, Harry saw that it was only a few minutes to 11. He placed a placeholder in his book, grabbed a light jacket and headed down the stairs. Amelia was still awake, reading some reports from her office and sipping tea as the wireless played. "Is it 11 already?" she asked as Harry came down the steps. "Pretty close," Harry said. "I know you'll be with Dumbledore tonight, but I want you to be careful. Don't take any chances. Don't be a hero if anything happens," Amelia said, looking at him hard. "Do you know where it is we're going?" Harry asked suspiciously. "I don't, but with Dumbledore, you can never tell what kind of errand he might be running." There was a knock on the door and Amelia rose from her seat and opened it to find Albus Dumbledore standing in the moonlight, and congenial smile on his face. "A good evening to you, Amelia, and to you as well, Harry. I'd like to thank you for consenting to accompany me this evening." "Sure." Harry nodded. "Where is it we're going?" "We shall be going to call on an old colleague." Dumbledore smiled as Amelia stood aside to allow him to enter the house. "I am hoping very much to coax him out of retirement to come and teach again, as we are in need of a new potions professor." "What happened to Snape?" Harry asked a little too eagerly. "Professor Snape is quite well. He has agreed to take on the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher this year." "Oh no." Harry groaned, and Dumbledore smiled. "It is not as bad as all that, Harry. I am quite aware of the difference of opinion between you both." "Difference of opinion?" Harry asked, his anger rising. "He hates me. He's arrogant, disrespectful, and childish. He is also well versed in the dark arts, and will provide you all with the very best education in the subject. I implore you to pay attention to his classes this year, Harry. I have had words with Professor Snape about his attitude, and I am confident that you will find him more tolerable this year." "And if I don't? What if he decides to use me as a practice dummy when he wants to demonstrate some spell or something?" Harry asked. "I do not think that will happen." Dumbledore smiled. "But should you have a legitimate complaint about his teaching methods, then you should bring the matter to my attention at once." "I will handle the matter at once." Harry said nothing, but inside he was seething. He wasn't convinced that Snape would be any better to him or anyone else this year. Harry was positive that Snape would see being the defense teacher as a pass to show off some of the nastiest curses and hexes around. Dumbledore could see that Harry was still displeased, but there was nothing for it. The decision had been made. The headmaster figured it would be best to change the topic. "We should be off. The night will not wait for us, nor will Horace. Amelia, I will have Harry home by 1 o'clock." "See that you do," Amelia said, folding her arms across her chest. "I assume that Susan will be home by the time we return so that we may all speak together." "I'll keep her awake." "Very good. Good evening to you," Dumbledore said with a soft bow, before leading Harry out of the cottage. "Bye." Harry waved and Amelia gave a wave in return. Harry and Dumbledore walked in silence until they passed the outer wards and Dumbledore offered his arm to Harry. "We shall be operating this evening, so please hold tightly." Harry obliged, and in a very discomforting instant, they were standing in the middle of a small park with a large marble fountain which was shut off at the moment. Harry heard crickets all around them, and a cat yowling nearby. "Where are we, sir?" Harry asked. "This is the charming village of Budleigh Baberton. Please follow me." They began heading up a well-lit street together. "So, who is this teacher we're going to be talking to?" "Horace Slughorn. He taught potions for a great number of years." He was offered the position of headmaster, but he refused it. He has never thought of himself as a leader. He prefers to inspire others to greatness. Horace enjoys a simple, comfortable life, filled with gifts from those he has helped out along the way. Back when he was a teacher, he had a sort of club made of students he felt were destined for greatness. If I am not very much mistaken, your mother was one of his most favorite students. Harry perked up at once. He was always interested in hearing anything about his mother and father. Not to change the subject terribly, but I confess myself curious as to how things are between yourself and Miss Bones. Dumbledore said, sparing a glance to the young man beside him. Good. Harry said simply, his mind replaying the kiss they had shared the day before, and the idiotic grin appearing on his face. If your expression is any indication, I would hazard a guess that good is downplaying things a bit. Dumbledore chuckled. And Harry found that he couldn't stop himself from joining the headmaster's mirth. I guess. Harry shrugged. We're still learning about each other, but I think we both want a lot of the same things. It was really tough in the beginning, and I'm not stupid enough to believe that it's going to be smooth from here on out. A very wise assumption. Dumbledore nodded. Every relationship, be it a casual acquaintance, or a lifelong lover, requires a certain amount of understanding. I would offer you this small bit of advice. Always tell the truth. No matter the situation, remain 100% honest. Treat your special friend with the same respect and courtesy that you wish to receive from her, and you will find that things become much easier. I'll keep it in mind. Harry said flatly. Harry, have you told either Mr. Weasley or Miss Granger about the prophecy? Harry started, but shook his head. I feared you hadn't. Dumbledore admitted. I think it would be a good idea to do so. You do them a disservice by keeping it to yourself. Have they not proven their loyalty to you? I didn't want to burden them with it. Harry shrugged, looking guilty. I think you will find them more than willing to share your burdens, Harry. And Miss Bones as well. You think I should tell Susan? Harry looked petrified now, but Dumbledore merely nodded. You underestimate those you call friend, Harry. It is admirable that you wish to take on this fight on your own, but you must never forget those who fight with you because they care for you. Trust in them as they trust in you. All of them. I'll think about it, Harry said, and Dumbledore let the subject drop. They walked for a moment in silence before Harry spoke. Sir, I was wondering about my scar, it's been feeling weird lately. Dumbledore now stopped and turned to face Harry with a very puzzled expression. Weird in what way? The old man asked. Well, first off, I haven't felt anything from it since the end of last year. I haven't had any visions, or even any of the sharp prickling it used to do. Dumbledore's puzzled expression was replaced by something more pleased. I had expected this, Dumbledore said as they resumed their journey. After his attempt to possess your mind, Lord Voldemort is no doubt using a clemency against you. You caused him great pain, and he does not wish for that to be repeated. Plus, I do not think he wishes for you to know his plans for the future. So there is such things as miracles, Harry said sarcastically. Indeed. Dumbledore smiled. Well, yesterday when Susan and I... Harry felt his face get hot. He didn't really want to reveal the very private details of his intimacy with Susan to the headmaster, but he had to know what was happening. Susan and I were talking, and I felt this strangeness. It was like this pleasant sort of tingle. A tingle. The best way to describe it would be the same as when your foot falls asleep. Harry tried. I see. Dumbledore nodded. And you say you were with Miss Bones? Yeah, Harry confirmed. May I ask what you were doing when this tingling first became apparent? Uh. That's is today that we were together, talking. Dumbledore smiled and his eyes twinkled especially brilliantly. I see. Was all he said. They walked quietly for a moment, Harry looking anywhere but at his headmaster and Dumbledore smiling to himself. I'm afraid I do not have enough information, but I would make a guess that the connection you share with Lord Voldemort could be weakening. I would suggest that if you felt this when you spent time with Miss Bones, that perhaps it is her presence that has started this weakening. But it is only a guess. You should tell me if this tingling persists or gets better or worse. Okay. Harry said quickly, now regretting mentioning the matter at all. Here we are. Dumbledore said. He was about to pass through a wrought iron gate when he stopped suddenly, and peered around them. Wand out, Harry. He said before silently moving towards the house. They moved through the door and into the house itself, which was a rather impressive with its large manicured lawn and the brick and iron fence. Harry thought it would be a nice place to live, until he stepped inside and beheld the grisly sight. It was clear to Harry that there had been a fight of some sort. There was broken crockery all about the floor, and scorch marks on the walls. Harry saw what looked to be blood on several weights, and devastation all around. Maybe he wasn't here. Harry said softly, but Dumbledore shook his head. He was, and he still is. Harry noticed that Dumbledore was examining a rather ugly-looking chair quite closely. Harry was stunned when Dumbledore stabbed his wand into the chair and it gave a rather loud ouch. The chair morphed into a rather rotund bald man with a thick walrus-like mustache. Good God, Albus, did you really need to poke so hard? The man who Harry guessed must be Horace Slughorn said irritably. A rather clever disguise, Horace. Dumbledore smiled. Slughorn shook his head. Not clever enough. I had very little time. I was in the bath and I didn't hear my intruder ward go off. I thought for sure it was those blasted Death Eaters. They've been tracking me for months. Perhaps now my offer is sounding much better now. Dumbledore asked, and Slughorn glared at the old man. Oh, all right. Slughorn sighed. I will admit that it would be nice to remain in one place for more than a month. Every time I seem to get comfortable, I have to leave. It's becoming harder to find suitable accommodations. The Muggles who own this house are in the Easter Islands for only another week. Perhaps it would be nice of us to tidy up. Dumbledore smiled, and Slughorn agreed. Harry watched in utter amazement as the devastation reversed itself. Mirrors and plates healed themselves, and furniture that had been knocked over stood upright and moved back to its original place. In seconds, the house was immaculate. And Harry was grinning at it all in wonderment. I really love magic, he said to himself. And who are you, lad? Slughorn asked, turning to face Harry. Horace Slughorn, I would very much like you to meet Harry Potter, Dumbledore said. Harry offered his hand and Slughorn took it, his eyes widening as they found the scar. But even more surprising to Harry was the way Slughorn seemed to be staring at his eyes. A pleasure, Mr. Potter, Slughorn said, then turned on Dumbledore. And you thought by bringing him I would fall over myself to return to Hogwarts? No, Dumbledore said. I had hoped my letters would be enough to convince you. That and the fact that if I could find you this easily, it will not be long before the Death Eaters find you. Did you not just say yourself that it was becoming harder to find acceptable accommodations? Slughorn bristled, which was rather comical looking to Harry. He noticed the slight smirk on the headmaster's face as well. You are quite adamant to have me return, aren't you? Slughorn glowered, but Dumbledore simply smiled back. I will admit that I brought Mr. Potter along to help me persuade you, but after what I have witnessed this evening, I am now convinced that you were going to say yes anyway. Slughorn bristled again, and then deflated. All right, he said, throwing his hands in the air. But I have some conditions, Albus. I want Professor Merryweather's old office. And I want Professor Ogden's old quarters. And I would like a raise. All are acceptable conditions. Dumbledore smiled, offering his hand. Slughorn took it, and for the first time, smiled. Well then, as September the 1st is just around the corner, I suppose I should prepare to leave then, shouldn't I? Slughorn smiled. I should also get to work on lesson plans. We shall leave you to it then. Dumbledore smiled, and motioned for Harry to head out. It was nice to meet you, sir, Harry said, and Slughorn smiled at Harry. I am sure we will get that chance to speak at length at the castle. Slughorn said, and Harry had the sensation that Slughorn was eyeing him greedily, like a goblin would stare at a pile of gold. Good night, Horace. Dumbledore said, and he and Harry head back into the night. That was odd. Harry said, and Dumbledore nodded. I had thought it would be much harder to convince Horace to return, but it seems clear that he has not been enjoying his retirement. Especially in the last few months. What do you mean? Harry asked. As I told you, Professor Slughorn, as we must now call him, likes his comfort. Having to move around a lot has undoubtedly worn on him. I noticed that many of his most prized possessions were absent in that house, and I am certain that above all else, he is frightened. Why should he be any more frightened than anyone else? Harry asked. Because Professor Slughorn is the only other person alive, besides myself, that remembers Lord Voldemort as he was at Hogwarts as a student. Harry had no time to ponder that statement as Dumbledore took Harry by the arm and operated him back to his own home. There were still lights on in the windows, and Harry followed Dumbledore back up the hill towards the house, where Amelia opened the door, looking relieved that he had returned. You're late, she said. Dumbledore retrieved a pocket watch and frowned. My apologies, he said. It was a bit further than I had anticipated. Come in, Amelia said, and Harry and Dumbledore went inside the house. Susan was sitting on the sofa, and embraced Harry when he came in. Have fun while I was away? She asked with a soft smile. I'm not really sure how to answer that, Harry said, looking confused, and Susan snickered. If you would both have a seat, we have something to discuss with you, Dumbledore said, taking a seat himself. What's going on? Susan asked, looking worried. The first thing I wish to talk to you about is the continuation of the Defense Club, Dumbledore said, looking at Harry. Many students benefited from their involvement in it, and given our current situation, it would be good if you would be willing to teach more students. How many more? Harry asked skeptically. However many would like to learn. Dumbledore smiled. You would be given a teacher advisor to oversee things in case of an accident, but you would be in charge of the club. So long as it isn't Professor Snape, Harry said, choking on the title. Dumbledore nodded in understanding. Professor McGonagall has agreed to be the staff liaison. Is that acceptable? Perfect. Harry smiled. Now, as you are both in a very unique situation, I am going to grant you both some unique privileges. These are not to be abused, or I will be forced to take them away, and I do not wish to do that. So, you are both to maintain your schoolwork, and do try to stay out of trouble, Dumbledore said, giving Harry a very pointed look. I will also ask that you both continue special lessons with Auror Tonks and Alastair Moody. Both teens nodded in agreement, and Dumbledore smiled. Very well. The two of you will have extended curfews. You will have the same curfew as our head boy and girl. You will also be granted access to each other's houses. You are not under any circumstances to reveal the passwords to any other student. Sir, why are we being allowed these things? Susan asked curiously. It is to allow you both time for each other. I promise you that you will find your 6th year quite busy, and I believe that given your circumstances, you will need time to spend with each other. You know, I'm starting to wonder why you are so concerned with how much time we spend together. I think there might be more going on with this contract than you've told us. Harry looked at Amelia and Dumbledore, who just smiled back at the tens. I simply wish to see you happy, Harry. You, more than anyone I've ever met, deserve to have a good life. Dumbledore said. A few minutes later, the headmaster bade them good night. When Amelia walked him to the door, Susan turned to Harry looking a bit worried. You really think there's something we're not being told? She asked. I'm not sure, but after 5 years, I've learned that Dumbledore isn't always forthcoming with bad news. He prefers to save your feelings rather than be 100% honest. They were silent for a minute, and Susan grabbed Harry's hand, making him look into her blue eyes. Will you promise to always be honest with me? She asked. So long as you promise to always be honest with me, no matter what. Susan nodded and kissed him softly. Please like and subscribe.